Hey guys, so today we are going to talk about macromolecules. What I want you to do is go ahead and get your notes ready. And then as we're going, you can stop me if you need to pause to take notes and all that good stuff. So first off, well, what is a macromolecule? A macromolecule is a large molecule, and it's made from carbon compounds. So in order for something to be a macromolecule, it has to be made from carbon. So all of these elements that we are going to, or excuse me, all these macromolecules that we're going to talk about today, all four of them have carbon in them, or made up of carbon. And something also important about a macromolecule is that it can be broken down into a thing called a monomer, which we'll learn about a little bit, and a polymer. Macromolecules are in everything that we eat. We are made up of macromolecules, and so as we go throughout the year, we're going to continue to resort back to these four macromolecules that we're going to talk about because they ultimately make up everything about us, the things that we consume, and so they're going to be very vital throughout this whole year whenever we are learning about the different elements of life. So first up, just to kind of go over what the monomer versus polymer is, remember a macromolecule can be broken down into these two terms. So mono equals one. So a macromolecule is going to be a large molecule, and if we break it down, then it means that we've got one subunit of that molecule. So here's a good little image to kind of help you monomer, meaning mono. If we were to think about a macromolecule, it would be a long, long stack of Legos potentially. If we think about Legos as our primary example, a monomer would be when we break up those individual Legos. Okay, so this red one here is a monomer, this blue one here is a monomer, and so forth. All right, on this image, it's also showing you, okay, here's our macromolecule. If we just continue to have this thread going, one of those units is going to be a monomer. So mono equals one, and then mer is subunit, so one unit. Moving on to polymer, polymer means many. So many, it means we're going to have multiple subunits. So going back to this model here, this whole strand right here is talking about a polymer. If we were going to do the Lego example, it says here polymer of 3 monomers. So here we've got a polymer because they're all connected together. So we've got many subunits. Polymer of 5 monomers. We've got 5 monomers here, all connected, which would make a polymer. All right. We're going to talk about the different polymers and monomers within our macromolecules a little bit later. But first, I want to go ahead and introduce you to these macromolecules. Macromolecules are also known as biomolecules, so sometimes you might hear that phrase used interchangeably. But what it is a molecule that is produced by a living organism. All right, so anything that is living has macromolecules, produces them. So you might be thinking, well, a cheeseburger is not living. Okay, correct. But it comes from all things that have been living. All right, so here we've got, if you want to follow along with your notes, here we've got a bun. All right, made out of bread, made out of wheat. All right, so that comes from a plant, comes from once a living thing. All right, and something that we find in bread is a carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is a macromolecule. So this is one of the macromolecules we have here is a carbohydrate. This burger here is just to kind of help you remember everything, all the 4 different macromolecules that we'll be talking about, just shown in one full image of where we get them. So here then we've got cheese. All right, so cheese comes from, there's different elements of it, but we know that it comes from a cow, okay? Or depending on the cheese, it comes from some type of animal that produces milk in order to make that cheese. And cheese has multiple macromolecules, but one of the macromolecules that it primarily has is a lipid. So by this cheese, we're going to show that, okay, our second macromolecule, something that our body produces, is a lipid. The third one that we're going to talk about is this patty. All right, it could be a beef patty, a turkey patty, whatever. But this patty came from an organism, a living thing, usually an animal, and that patty has protein. Now, protein is our third macromolecule that we're going to be discussing. So here we have protein. And then last but not least, we have nucleic acid. So nucleic acid to me, well, first off, it's showing you it's being represented by this lettuce. But nucleic acid to me is super cool because nucleic acid is in anything that was once living. And it's because nucleic acid comes from our DNA. So it's kind of like, in a sense, if you were to look at it from a funky standpoint, you could say that, the nucleic acids that we receive are from other organisms' DNA. Okay? So that's why this lettuce contains nucleic acid, because it is a once living thing that had DNA, and we are getting the nucleic acid from that DNA. So just in review, our 4 macromolecules, and the 4 that we are talking about today is carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. All right, so first we're going to talk about carbohydrates. Okay, excuse me, let me move this to where you can see it. There we go. So first we're going to talk about carbohydrates, and we're going to break this up into a couple of different talking points. So first up, let's talk about elements. So elements is like what you're thinking about. You think of a periodic table, right? So the elements here that we have in carbohydrates is for sure carbon, because remember I said that a macromolecule is anything that that contains that was from a living thing, contains carbon, and it also includes hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, so our carbohydrates include carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And as we talk about the other 3, some of the other 3 we might add on some more elements. Okay, so carbohydrates again, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And there are 2 types of carbs. There is a monosaccharide and a polysaccharide. Okay, 2 types of carbs. One of them is a monomer and one of them is a polymer. So I want you to think to yourself, okay, which one of these is a monomer and which one of these is a polymer. So here it shows a starch strand, which is a carbohydrate, and inside of it here, it's just doing a close-up view right here, is glucose, and glucose is a monosaccharide. All right, so whenever we think about this starch is a polysaccharide, okay, and the glucose is the monosaccharide, because remember, mono means one, and so we've got our one subunit right here, and we've got our multiple subunits going on right there. A function of carbohydrates is it's the main source of energy. Okay, that's why marathon runners, a lot of times the night before or a couple days before, they like to pasta load or carb load. That's because carbohydrates are going to give us our main source of energy, so we want our body to pull from those first. It's also a structural support for plants. So plants use carbohydrates essentially to maintain their structure within themselves and their cells. Carbohydrates are often going to end in OSE or OS. So if you hear something like sucrose, glucose, and so forth, that would kind of give you the hint that, it might be a carbohydrate. Okay? Some examples of what we consume that contains carbs. We've got bread, cucumbers, and potatoes. That's going to be one that we contain carbs. These also contain other macromolecules. I'm not saying that it's just within, that these just contain carbs, but this is kind of what you could use as a reference because this majority does contain carbohydrates. Okay, so we've talked about carbohydrates. Now I want us to move on to lipids. I'm going to move this back. Okay, perfect. So lipids is also, you may not have heard of the term lipids, but you have heard of the term fat. Okay, lipids is essentially a fat. and the elements that it is made up of is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So the same as a carb, essentially. All right. The structure here is it's nonpolar, just meaning that it doesn't dissolve in water. Think about whenever you have olive oil and then you pour it into water, they're not going to mix together because it doesn't dissolve. It kind of sits on it like an additional layer. So lipids is going to be nonpolar. Again, it doesn't dissolve. And it's composed of fatty acid chains that are connected to glycerol. So all of our other macromolecules, they only have one monomer and one polymer. Lipids is cool because it's made up of two monomers. All right. The first monomer is a fatty acid, and the second monomer is a glycerol. So whenever we take these together and we combine them, that makes a triglyceride, tri meaning three fatty acids, and a glycerol. It makes a triglyceride, which is the polymer. Okay, so here our monomers are three fatty acids and a glycerol, and then those together would make a triglyceride, which would be the polysaccharide. All right, we take a bunch of triglycerides and put them together, and that would be making our lipid. So it's just kind of like we're building upon these different terms to eventually make up the macromolecule. So next here we've got a lipid. All right, so we're still talking about the lipid. Like I said, monomer is fatty acid and glycerol. Polymer is phospholipids. Okay, so that's coming from the fatty acids, and triglyceride coming from the fatty acids and glycerol. A function for it is going to be the long-term energy source. So what our body does first whenever we're running, it pulls from the carbs, but then after it doesn't have carbs to pull from, then it goes to the lipids, it goes to the fats. Okay, that's why endurance runners tend to be not have as much of a fat composition, is because their body runs through the carbs and then it starts to eat away at the fats. It's also waterproof covering, like we were saying with the whole oil and water, it just doesn't mix. And it's actually what makes up our cell membranes. So within our cell, we have this organelle called the cell membrane, and we're going to talk about that in a week or two. And so remembering that lipids make up that cell membrane. Here are three food examples. So we've got cheese here. Cheese is filled with lipids. Any type of oil, sunflower oil, avocado oil, vegetable oil, any of that is going to contain a lot of lipids, a lot of healthy fats. And then we've got our eggs. Eggs contain, again, they contain more than one thing. Like eggs is also a great source of protein. But whenever we're thinking about this, the egg yolk is going to contain a lot of healthy fats. Okay.